In this example, we're going to see how to build a URL shortening application using Node.js and Couchbase. So there's many different ways to do this in Node.js and Couchbase in particular. So for example, we could be using what's called nickel queries, which are SQL-like queries, or we can be using an ODM called Ottoman, which would be more comparable to, say, Mongoose if you're using MongoDB. We're going to be using the query approach. So we're actually going to be using what's called nickel queries, so N1QL. These are SQL-like queries, so you can actually run SQL against your JSON data. It's pretty cool, especially if you're coming from a relational database like MySQL or Postgres. But before we go ahead and start coding our application, so this URL shortener application, let's go ahead and configure Couchbase Server. So I do already have Couchbase Server installed on my machine. I'm using Couchbase Server, let's take a look at the version here, 4.5 Enterprise Edition. So you only need Couchbase Server 4 or higher. You can use the latest version, but as long as you have 4 or higher, because Nickel was actually introduced in version 4.0. So if you go over your data buckets, I do have only one bucket, the default bucket. You can use that bucket if you want, so that way everyone's on the same page here. We're going to go ahead and create a new bucket and configure it the way we want to work with it. So let's go ahead and choose Create New Data Bucket. I'm going to call this data bucket Example. It's going to be a Couchbase bucket. I don't need 1.5 gigabytes worth of memory. Instead, let's go ahead and make it smaller. 120 is fine. For this example application, it's really overkill because we won't be storing a whole lot in it. And then you can leave everything else as the default. So scroll down to the bottom and then choose Create. So let's give it a second to create this bucket. All right, so the bucket's now created. It's green. It's good to go. We can't start querying this bucket with Nickel until we create at least one index on this bucket. So what we want to do is we want to look at our index tab. We can confirm there's no indexes currently created. So let's go ahead and create one. So I'm going to be using the query editor. So this is Query Workbench. If you don't have Query Workbench because you're using a different version, the Couchbase shell client will work, CBQ, which is just a command line interface. Doesn't really matter how you do it, as long as you use as long as you can choose Create Primary Index on Example, because that's the name of our bucket, using GSI. So this is a very basic index. It's fine for this example. In a production environment with lots of data, this probably won't cut it. It won't be fast enough. Instead, you'll probably want to create more specific indexes. But for this example, this is fine. So let's go ahead and choose Execute and go to the Indexes tab, and you can see that that index is now created. So our Couchbase server is now set up and ready to go. We can start developing our application with Node.js. So let's go back to our command line. We're going to go ahead and create a project on our desktop. I'm going to create a new directory. I'm going to call it Make Directory. And let's go ahead and call it URL Project. Doesn't really matter what you call it. Navigate into that project. And we need to create a new Node.js application. So let's go ahead and using npm, because we assume you already have Node.js installed. Let's go ahead and say npm init --y. So it'll just skip over and it'll choose the defaults for everything. So what that did for us was it created a package.json file in our directory. This package.json file will handle all of our dependencies, and that's pretty much all. So with that package.json, now we can actually add the dependencies we wish to use. So let's go ahead and say npm install, and we want to install Couchbase. We want to install Express for Express Framework. We want to install Body Parser. So Body Parser allows us to use body inside of our requests, or HTTP requests, so we can have like a JSON body. And then we want to use a library called hash IDs. So hash IDs, because this is a URL shortener application, the whole point here is to take a long URL and shrink it. So use a much smaller URL, and that's possible through hashing. So we could create a small hash. Hash IDs allows for small hash generation, and then we can use that hash as the key to our short URLs, and you'll see that as we go along. So let's do --save. All right, so all of our dependencies were added. They were actually added to a Node modules directory, and they are kept track of inside the package.json. What we can do now is we can create a file called app.js, but in reality it could be named whatever you want it to be called. I'm going to create it by saying touch app.js. You can create it however you want, but that went ahead and added a file called app.js that sits next to node modules and package.json. Now what I want to do is I want to open up this project in my editor. So I'm going to be using Atom by GitHub. You could use whatever you want. It doesn't matter as long as you have something that you can code in. So we're going to say Atom, and we're going to open up this project. All right, so the project is open. I'm going to open up the app.js file, and this is where we're going to spend all of our time. If you were doing a much larger application or production application, you might split it up into several files for cleanliness. But this is a very small example. We're going to keep everything inside of this particular file. First thing we want to do is we want to import each of the dependencies that we had just installed. So we can say var Couchbase equals require Couchbase. We can say var express equals require express. Var body parser equals require body parser. And then you get the idea. We're going to do hash IDs now. Var hash IDs equals require hash IDs. So nothing too complicated as of right now. With all of our dependencies imported, now we can worry about initializing them. So we're going to say var app equals express. So we're initializing Express framework. We're also going to initialize because we want to use Nickel. We can say var N1QL query equals couchbase.n1QL query. We want to initialize the body parser. So we could say app.use body parser.json. And remember, this allows us to accept JSON data inside of, say, put requests, post requests, things like that. So when we create data, we want to use app.use. We can say body parser.url encode. We can say extended true, add a semicolon there. And at this point now we want to establish a connection to our Couchbase cluster. So I'm only using one node. It's installed on one of my local machines. It's not this particular machine, but it's on a local machine on my network. It's one node. All you need to do is define one node because a Couchbase cluster is peer-to-peer. Once you connect to one, you have a cluster map, and you have knowledge of every other node in that cluster at that point. So what we're going to do is we're going to say var bucket equals, we're going to say new couchbase.cluster. We're going to find the cluster host. So we're going to say Couchbase. And at this point, I believe it's at 10.0.1.62 is my host. If I go to my web browser and I look at my URL bar, that is in fact it. I don't need to worry about the port in this connection string, but I added the host name. The next thing we want to do is we want to open that bucket. So let's go ahead and say open bucket. So we have the connection established. Now we need to open up that bucket that we created. We called it example, or whatever you might have called it. And now our database can be worked with at this point. Before we start creating endpoint functions, let's go ahead and get the bare essentials so that way this server actually runs. So let's go ahead and say var server equals app.listen. We're going to listen on port 3000. And then as soon as that server starts, let's go ahead and print out that we're now listening. So we can say console.log. We can say listening on port. And then for the port, we're actually going to say server.address.port. So that way we'll just say it. Let's go to our terminal and check it out so far. It should only say that. It should start serving our application, but we can't really do anything with our application as of right now. So to run our application, what we would do is we would say node, and then we call it app.js. And as you can see, now it says listening on port 3000. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cancel this server now. Perfect. So let's jump back into our code now. We can actually start defining our RESTful endpoints. So just to give you some scope on what we're doing here, we're going to have 3 endpoints. We're going to have an endpoint that will allow us to pass in a long URL, and have that long URL swapped out with a short URL and have them both saved to our database. We're going to have an endpoint that will allow us to expand a short URL. So if we pass it a short URL, it'll look up in our database for the long URL, and it'll tell us what it is in case maybe we want to unmask that short URL. The third endpoint is strictly a redirection endpoint. So when we navigate to that short URL, we want to be redirected to whatever the long URL is. So we want a very effective URL shortener in that sense. There's plenty of other things that you can do with a URL shortener. Maybe you want to track statistics like how many times that link was opened or navigated to, things like that. We're not going to worry about that in this particular example. We want the basics, but we want to do enough to where you feel like you're getting enough out of it to be able to accomplish this more advanced stuff afterwards. So let's start with the first endpoint. The first endpoint will be the creation endpoint. So what we're going to say is we're going to say app.post. We're going to say create. That's going to be our endpoint name. We're going to say function, request, response, and let's define what we want inside of this creation endpoint. The first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we've actually been provided a long URL to be shrunken down into. So we can say if request.body.long URL. So if it does not exist, what we can say is we can say return response.status. So we're going to provide it a status code, send, and we're going to say status. So we're just going to send an object here, and we're going to say, I don't know, we can say error. We can really put whatever we want inside of this. We're going to say message, and for the message we're going to say a long URL is required. So very simple, so that way we know where we messed up. All right, so provided that a long URL was provided, now we can proceed on to the next step. So the goal here behind this creation is we want unique short URLs. We want one short URL and one long URL to be saved. We don't want duplicates. So to make this possible, what we need to do is when we pass in a long URL, we need to query the database and make sure that it isn't already saved. If it's already saved, we need to return the short URL that's saved. If it's not already saved, it doesn't exist in the database, we're going to create it, we're going to save it, and we're going to return it. So those are our steps right there. So let's start by doing the lookup. So let's say bucket.query. We're going to say N1QL query because we can't just use a string. Couchbase won't understand just a string, so we have to parse it. So we're going to say from string, and we're going to pass it a query now. So we're going to say select. In backticks, we're going to say bucket._name, so that way we don't have to keep using example. We don't want to hard code those values, but you could say example here and avoid the whole plus thing. So backtick and then star. So we're going to select all properties from this query, from, and we're going to say backticks again, and we're going to say plus bucket._name plus, and then after the backticks, where long URL equals $1. So what we're doing here is we're doing a parameterized query. So we don't want to just we don't want to add a plus in there because if we did that, we could potentially suffer from SQL injection. But by using a parameterized query, we can fight that and protect our database. So we add that, comma. Let's go ahead and add our parameter. So our parameter would be request.body.long URL. So that's our single parameter, $1. And we're going to say function, and we're going to say error result. And then at which point we can actually define what's going to happen inside of our callback after this query executes. So let's check it out. First of all, we're going to say if error. So if there was any kind of error, maybe we have a typo in our query, anything that would stop it from completing. Returning no data is not an error. It still succeeded even if there was no data. I'm talking an actual error. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to say return response status. Let's go ahead and give it another 400 error. I honestly, I don't know all of these errors, so I just pretty much use 400 for everything. But there is a whole list of actual error meanings online that you can find. So you can say send, and we can say error. Otherwise, there was no error. So what we want to do is we want to check to see if there was actually results in that result set. We want to make sure if it was found or if it wasn't found. So what we can say is we can say if result.length equals 0. So there was no results found in this query. So in this scenario, we're going to be creating a new short URL and saving it. So we're going to say var hash IDs equals new hash IDs. What we're going to do is we're going to construct our object that will be saved into Couchbase. We're going to say var response equals, and this is an object. We're going to say ID, and the ID is going to be hash IDs dot encode, so we're encoding a value. And the value that we're encoding in order to preserve uniqueness is we're going to encode the timestamp. So if we encode the timestamp, it should remain pretty unique. So what we're going to say is we're going to encode, we're going to say new date dot get time. We're also going to add another property. This property is going to be the long URL because we do want to save that. So request.body.long URL. And we can add a semicolon there, but we're not quite done yet. We also need to add the short URL. So the short URL is very simple. The short URL is going to say response.short URL equals, we're going to provide it whatever our current host is. We can add it somewhere else, so that way it's not in the middle of our code if we really wanted to. But right now it's fine right here. So we can say localhost. We're running on port 3000. We can add a slash there. But we also want to say response.id. So we want to get this short hash value, which is also our document ID, and add it to our short URL as well. So with that short URL and our whole object created now, we can save it. So we can say bucket.insert. The ID of our document or our key is going to be response.id. We're going to save the entire response, and we're going to have a callback here. So inside of the insert, we do want to check to see if there was an error of some sort. So I'm going to copy lines 19 through 21 and paste them in to save me some typing here. If there was no error, what we can do is we can say res.send response. So we want to send whatever our response was. We don't want to send the result because the result is going to have a cast value. It's going to have stuff that's not particularly useful to the end user. That satisfies the scenario where it doesn't exist in the database. We did our lookup, it doesn't exist. Now let's cover the scenario where maybe it does exist. So let's say else. And in this scenario, we're going to say response, send, and since the result here on line 18 is a array, what we want to return is the first value of that array. So we're going to say result 0, add a semicolon there. So at this point, this particular endpoint should be safe, and we can actually test it out right now. So if I go to my terminal and I choose to say node app.js, so it didn't error out, that's a good sign. What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate back into my web browser. I should have a tool called Postman on my computer. This is a free Google Chrome extension. It's good for testing APIs. I can go ahead and clear that so that way we don't get confused. I've done this short URL, this URL shortener in other programming languages as well, not just Node. But let's go ahead and say localhost port 3000. This is a post request. I'm going to hit the create endpoint. The body, it does already have a body in my Postman. What we want to do is we want to make sure it's a JSON request, has a long URL. In this case, I'm providing it a particular long URL, which isn't really long, but it could be if we wanted it to be. I'm going to choose send. So as our result here, we have the ID, the long URL, and the short URL, and the ID is appended to the end of the short URL. So if we go into our web browser, into the database itself, we can go to data buckets, we can go to example, and that document is in fact saved into Couchbase. So that brings us to the next step. The next step being we want to create a way to expand a short URL. We're not going to navigate quite yet. So let's work on the next endpoint. So I'll scroll down. We're going to create an endpoint, say app.get. This endpoint is going to be called expand. Function, request, response, and we're going to figure out what we want inside of it. So this one will be a little easier than the last one. The last one was probably the most difficult part of this whole application, not because it was difficult to code, but just the logic involved was a little difficult. So in this case, we're going to say, I'm going to copy lines 15 through 17, just to save us a little time. It's not going to be part of the body this time. Our variable is going to be, because this is a GET request, there is no body, it's going to be part of the query. So, and it's also going to be called short URL. So if we go into the response here, we can say a short URL is required. If there was no error, then we can proceed with our logic. So in this case, our query is going to be very similar. We're going to say bucket.query N1QL query.fromString. And let's go ahead and enter our query. It's going to be select, and then we're going to do backtick. We're going to include that bucket name. Again, you can hard code this if you really wanted to. We're going to do dot star from, and then backtick again. Example, not example. I mean, that's the name of our bucket, but what we want to do is bucket._name. And then we want to say where short URL equals $1. So it's not long URL, it's short URL. We're going to say request.query.short URL. And then function error result, and then what's going to happen in this callback. So again, like I've done previously, I'm going to copy this error because I don't like to type, paste it in, and then we're going to cover the scenario where there was no error, it succeeded. So if it succeeded, we're going to say response.send, and then we're going to do a condition here. If it existed, we want to return the first row, but it's an array. So if it doesn't exist, we want to return an empty object. We don't want to worry about arrays in this response because we should only be expecting one. So we can actually do that with a ternary operation. So we can say result dot length greater than 0. So we're going to say if this condition is true, if the length is greater than 0, we can say we're going to return the result and then the first element of that result. Otherwise, as the false condition of this ternary operation, we're going to return an empty object, just like that. There's different ways you can do it. I like to just try to keep it in one line. You can do an if statement if you wanted to. Same thing, no big deal. But our expand endpoint should be good. So I'm going to go back to my terminal. I'm going to stop this application. I'm going to rerun it. I'm going to go back to Postman. Now I'm going to cheat a little. There's only one item in here. So I'm going to copy that one item, that short URL. I realize I copied the quotation mark. That's fine. I'll remove it in a second. But we're going to do a GET request. We're going to do expand. We're going to look at our parameters here. But we're also going to say short URL equals, and we can paste that value in. I'm going to get rid of the quotation marks here. So this is what we're expecting to pass. It's a query parameter. So if I run it, this same result should be returned. So I'm going to say send. And in fact, it was returned. So that's what we expect. We expect to be able to pass in a short URL, and it's going to tell us everything about that short URL. And if we really wanted to, we could only return the long URL if we wanted to. But for us, it's we might as well just return everything. So that's our second endpoint. Now we get to go to the final endpoint. So this one's a little different. So going back into our code here, let's create another GET endpoint. So we're going to say app.get. This is going to be what I call the root endpoint. So it's going to be /, and we're going to do :id. So this is going to accept URL parameters, not query parameters, not body parameters, URL parameters. Function, request, response, and then whatever we want to do inside of this callback. So in this case, again, we're going to do some copy paste here. I'm going to copy lines 15 through 17, paste it in. This time, instead of body and query, we're going to say params. It's going to be ID. And then the response, in case if there was an error, we're going to say an ID is required. All right. If there was no error, this is where things are a little different. So if there was no error, what we're going to say is we're going to say res, so response, redirect, not send, redirect. And we're going to say, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself here. We have nothing to redirect yet. So we actually need to do our query first. So what we want to do is we want to say bucket.get. So we're getting a document by its ID. The ID being the request, params.id. We're going to say function. We're going to say error result. We're going to say, well, what happens if there's an error? Well, then we're going to do the same thing that we always do. We're going to return that error. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to say res.redirect. We're going to say result.value.long URL. So in the event that we found this particular document by its ID, we're going to redirect to that long URL. And we're going to try that in just one moment here. So let's go ahead and rerun our application. It runs without error. So if I go to my Postman, or better yet, if I go to my database, I'm going to copy this URL, this short URL. We don't need Postman for this final endpoint. I'm going to copy the short URL. I'm going to open a new tab, and I'm going to paste that short URL in. I'm going to hit enter. And sure enough, it took me to that long URL. So it did exactly what we expected of it. So you just saw how to create a very basic URL shortener. This URL shortener used Node.js and NQL. If you wanted to, you could use an ODM like Ottoman. That might be best saved for another video tutorial. Both are fair scenarios. It's a matter of preference more than anything. But it really taught you how to create a RESTful application that used a NoSQL database. So it really put your knowledge to work.